For 18 days, he didn't move. Not for food. Not for shelter. Not even to survive. They thought he was lost. They thought he was broken. But the truth was much worse. The rain hadn't stopped for days, but still he sat there, soaked, shivering, unmoving. A German shepherd, once proud, once powerful, now just a ghost in the downpour. People passed him like he didn't exist. Cars splashed water onto his matted fur, but he didn't even flinch. He wasn't lost. He wasn't waiting for food. He was waiting for someone who would never return. They called him aggressive. They said he shut down. But what they didn't see was the loyalty buried deep in his bones. What no one knew was that he used to save lives, that he had a handler, a partner, a purpose. And then one day, they took it all away. This is not just a story about a dog. This is a story about what happens when the world forgets its heroes, and what it takes for a broken soul to believe again. If this dog's silent loyalty touched your heart, don't just scroll, subscribe, and stand with the ones who can't speak but never stop waiting. One story at a time, let's make sure no hero is ever forgotten again. The rain had been falling for hours, sharp, cold, and endless. It cut through the silence of the early morning, soaking the cracked pavement of a forgotten railway crossing on the outskirts of a Colorado town that hadn't felt alive in years. And there, just beneath a rusting street lamp flickering weakly through the downpour, sat a German shepherd, not lying, not sleeping, just sitting, still as a statue. His coat, once thick and rich, was now caked in layers of mud and rain. His ribs poked out from under matted fur, his ears hung low, his eyes, open, wide, stared into the distance as if expecting something. Or someone. He didn't move when cars passed. He didn't flinch when thunder cracked the sky. He didn't even glance when a stranger tried to whistle or offer food. They called him the ghost dog, the waiting one. The locals had grown used to his presence, as haunting as it was. Some claimed he was just a stray. Others believed he had escaped from somewhere. But no one really asked why he wouldn't leave that one spot. Only a few noticed the deeper truth, that he wasn't waiting for shelter. He was waiting for someone who never came back. On the third night of rain, a gas station clerk named Evelyn stood in the doorway across the street and watched him for nearly an hour. He hadn't moved at all, not even when the rain pooled around his front paws, making them tremble slightly from the cold. Something about him didn't feel like a stray. He didn't search trash bins. He didn't beg. He didn't even react to barking dogs in the distance. He just waited. And something in his eyes, something hollow, made Evelyn think, that dog didn't get lost. He was left. She called local shelters. No answers. She posted photos online. Still nothing. So she started leaving out bowls of food and water by the light pole. Every morning they were untouched, until the 7th day. That morning, only the water bowl was empty. They didn't know his name. They didn't know where he had come from, but he had clearly once belonged to someone. His posture was too disciplined, his gaze too focused, the kind of focus you only find in trained working dogs, dogs with missions. Something had broken this one, not physically, but somewhere deep inside. And so, the shepherd waited. Rain or no rain, day or night. He waited where he had last seen the truck drive away, the one with the scent he would never forget. And even as his legs grew weak, even as his body thinned from hunger, even as strangers called him dangerous, or just a stray, he sat there, silent, motionless, forgotten by the world, because no matter what had happened, some part of him still believed his person would return. But what he didn't know was that the man he waited for had never stopped looking for him either. Before the silence, before the rain, before the stillness at the railway crossing, he had a name, a purpose, a world that made sense. They called him Shadow, not because he was invisible, but because he never left the side of the man who raised him. Shadow wasn't born in a kennel. He didn't come from a breeder with papers and prizes. He was found trembling under a collapsed porch in the aftermath of a wildfire, barely a pup, coughing smoke, eyes too young to understand the chaos around him. That's when Aidan Cross found him. A former combat medic turned rescue trainer, Aidan had spent years teaching dogs to do the impossible: track missing children in forests, sniff out survivors in ruins, run into places where no human dared go. But Shadow, he wasn't just another project. He was different. He learned faster, ran farther, refused to give up. And more than anything, he watched Aidan like he was the only thing that mattered. At Ridgewell Canine Response Center, nestled in a canyon outside Denver, Shadow became a legend in the making. While other dogs chased balls, Shadow learned to break through rubble to find human breath. While others barked at strangers, Shadow learned how to lie still beside a crying survivor until the shaking stopped. He worked search grids with precision. He obeyed hand signals in total silence, and when the call came, he answered. Flood in Missouri, storm wreckage in Nebraska, disaster drill in Montana. Shadow went, and every time he came back, muddy, exhausted, but never once disobeying a command. He wasn't just trained to save lives, he did. And then it ended. Not in fire, not in sirens, but in paperwork, in silence. One winter morning, the staff arrived to locked doors and printed memos. The center was closing, an injury during a live fire training, an insurance scandal, a lawsuit that gutted their funding overnight. What once was a place of purpose became just another failed non-profit, filed away in a legal cabinet. The dogs were listed as assets, assigned numbers, redistributed to shelters, testing facilities, security contractors, wherever the contracts paid most. Aidan fought. He argued, offered to buy Shadow's release, but the corporate board said no. Training property, they called him. Too valuable, too well-conditioned, too specialized to just let go. They took him away on a rainy Thursday. No warning, no chance for goodbye, no final look, just gone. Shadow didn't cry, didn't panic. He sat in the back of the transport van, staring out the side window, tail still, heart silent. He didn't understand contracts. He didn't understand liability. He only knew that the 1 cent he trusted had vanished. The van drove for hours. The smell of Aidan faded. The leash passed from hand to hand. The voices changed, but still, Shadow waited. First came the city shelter. Cement floors, barking walls, indifference. They called him unadoptable. He didn't eat, didn't engage. He growled at the handlers, but not from rage, from heartbreak. Then came the transfer to a K9 security facility. They tested his bite, ran drills, demanded aggression. But Shadow refused. He didn't want to attack. He wasn't a weapon. He had been trained to find the living, not destroy. So they labeled him unfit, moved him again. Months passed like fog. One day, during a stop at a roadside fuel station on a rainy highway, someone forgot to lock the crate. One careless moment, one open latch, and Shadow slipped out. Not in a sprint, not in chaos. He simply walked away. He didn't run into the forest. He didn't chase cars. He just followed the memory. Back toward the town, back toward the depot, back toward the last place he had seen Aidan's truck drive away. And that's how he ended up at the railway crossing. Not lost, not escaped, not dangerous, just waiting. for a voice he hadn't heard in months, for a hand he never stopped trusting. He was trained to save others. But now, no one came to save him. Freedom isn't always what it seems, especially when you never asked for it, especially when all you wanted was to be found. When Shadow slipped away that night from the back of a transport van at a gas station just outside Greeley, he didn't run in panic. He walked, head low, ears flicking at the wind, eyes forward, searching each movement in the dark. Not for danger, not for food, for someone, for Aidan. He crossed dry fields, rusting fences, a trailer park, and a stretch of cracked blacktop. He moved like a shadow, fittingly, avoiding people, barking dogs, headlights. By sunrise, he had made it to the edge of town. By noon, he was back at the depot, the last place he had seen the truck drive away. He stopped at the far corner of the gravel lot, circled once, and laid down, as if he expected time to rewind. It didn't. No one knew where he came from. They just saw what was in front of them, a large German shepherd sitting perfectly still for hours in the rain. Too still, too focused, too quiet to be astray. Some said he was dangerous. Others tried to coax him with treats, but he wouldn't come near, wouldn't touch food in front of strangers, wouldn't bark, wouldn't growl. He simply waited. Each night, the temperature dropped. Each day, his breathing grew heavier. But he stayed, unmoving, like the memory of something the world had forgotten how to love. Across the street, behind the fogged-up window of a small laundromat, a man named Daniel Reese started watching. He was nobody special, just a former mechanic, a quiet widower, someone who barely spoke. He kept his life small these days, fixed old washers, fed the alley cats, watched the rain. But that dog reminded him of something he couldn't explain. Every evening, Daniel brought a small bowl of boiled chicken and a clean towel. He never tried to pet Shadow. He never even crossed the road, just left the food and waited. Shadow didn't touch it for 4 days. On the 5th, Daniel saw the bowl licked clean. On the 6th, Shadow looked at him, just for a moment. On the 7th, he wagged his tail, once, but he never moved from his place, because in Shadow's mind, moving meant missing Aidan, and he couldn't risk that. Not again. Some prisons have guards and keys, some have steel bars. Shadow's was made of memory, a cage without walls, a leash made of hope. Then the patrol came, 2 animal control officers in a white city van, responding to reports of a large, aggressive shepherd loitering by the rail line. They arrived with gloves, poles, and sedation darts, ready for trouble. But they found none. They found a dog who didn't bark, didn't charge, didn't flee. He just sat there in the rain, eyes locked on the tracks, like he'd rather be hit by a train than touched by another stranger. And when they moved closer, one officer paused. "Wait, he's not growling." "Yeah," the other muttered. "He's just sitting." "That's weird." They lowered their tools. Shadow didn't resist when the leash slipped over his neck, didn't fight the crate, didn't even glance back as the doors shut behind him, because something in him had already shut down. They took him to a county shelter, 2 towns over. It was clean, crowded, busy, loud. They labeled him large male, approximately, 4 years, unchipped, possibly ex-service, behavior non-responsive, shows signs of learned commands but refuses engagement, no aggression. In simpler words, does nothing, doesn't bite, doesn't bark, just stares at the wall. He was moved to isolation, out of reach, out of sight, forgotten again. Days passed, then weeks. He didn't eat much, didn't drink unless the lights were off. didn't react when the janitor accidentally dropped a metal tray behind him. The staff began calling him the Ghost. Volunteers stopped asking about him. No one knew his story. No one knew he'd once walked through fire, that his ears had once twitched at the sound of breathing under rubble, that he had once searched a collapsed home for a heartbeat and found it. Now, he couldn't even look at a door without flinching. Then, one night, a junior staffer named Maya stayed late during a snowstorm. She was 19, new, nervous. She walked past Isolation and paused at his cage. She hadn't known much about Shadow, but something made her sit down, cross-legged on the floor outside the bars. She didn't speak, didn't offer treats, didn't call his name. She just sat. The way someone might wait beside a grave they didn't know they'd visit that day. Minutes passed, then hours, and eventually, Shadow turned his head, just slightly, and for the first time in weeks, he blinked. That was the moment Maya knew. He wasn't broken, he wasn't aggressive, he wasn't unresponsive. He was grieving, and the world hadn't left room for dogs to grieve. 3 days later, the shelter got a call. A man had seen a photo posted online, a blurry shot of a shepherd sitting in the rain near a depot. His name was Aidan Cross. He hadn't stopped looking. Not when they took Shadow. Not when the center shut down. Not when his calls went unanswered. And now, he was on his way. Shadow didn't know, couldn't know, but somewhere in his chest, something shifted. A flicker, a pause, a breath he hadn't taken in a long, long time. The day he returned wasn't stormy. It wasn't dramatic. The sky was just quiet. Clouds drifted above the county shelter like they didn't know whether to rain or move on. Inside Isolation Wing 3, nothing had changed. Shadow lay curled in the back corner of his kennel, head resting on concrete, eyes half open but unfocused. The volunteers walked past, whispers echoing off the tile walls. He doesn't respond to anyone. Won't even look at you. Poor guy must have been through hell. And then, just past noon, the front door chimed. Boots on tile, a voice at the reception desk. Low, calm, measured but shaking just enough to give something away. My name is Aidan Cross. I think you have my partner. Maya was the one who escorted him. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. The way Aidan walked, slow, careful, like every step might crack the floor beneath him, said enough. He wasn't coming for a dog. He was coming for a piece of himself. As they approached the final row of kennels, Aidan suddenly slowed. His breath caught. His shoulders tensed. Through the bars he saw a shape. Not the proud, poised figure he remembered, but thinner, quieter, dimmer, still unmistakable. Shadow, he whispered. The shepherd didn't react at first, didn't lift his head, didn't move his ears, just lay there, blinking. Then, without warning, his body stiffened, his nose twitched. He lifted his head just an inch, then froze again. And slowly, he turned. Eyes met. Not wild, not afraid, just wide, searching. And then something ancient, something deep, rose from inside him. A sound, choked, broken, escaped Shadow's throat. Not a bark, not a growl, but something caught between a whimper and a gasp. He stood, legs trembling, took one step forward, then another, and stopped inches from the bars, pressed his forehead against the steel. Still staring, Aidan knelt. "Hey, partner," he whispered, his voice breaking for the first time in years. "I'm sorry I was late." Shadow leaned harder into the bars, as if trying to erase the space between them, as if saying, "You came back. I knew you would." Maya, still frozen a few feet back, turned away, tears quietly streaking down her cheeks. That afternoon, The shelter waived protocol. No forms, no fees, just the words, "Reunited with Handler," written in permanent marker on a clipboard. Shadow didn't need a leash. He walked beside Aiden like no time had passed, like the rain had never fallen, like he had never waited alone. But Aiden saw the truth, the limp, the slight delay in responses, the way Shadow startled at sudden doors or metal sounds. This wasn't the same shepherd he had trained to run headfirst into chaos. This was a ghost, still learning how to live again. They didn't go home. Not yet. Aiden had sold his apartment months ago trying to fund his search. Now he lived in a borrowed camper on a friend's farmland just outside town. But that was okay. Shadow didn't need walls. He didn't need soft beds or chew toys. He needed space and quiet, and one person who wouldn't leave again. So that night, Aiden opened the camper door, laid down a blanket, and sat beside him. He didn't try to pet him, didn't whisper promises. He just stayed. And for the first time since the depot, Shadow fell asleep with someone beside him. The healing wasn't instant. There were nights Shadow woke up, panting, pacing in circles, eyes wild with dreams he couldn't explain. There were days when he wouldn't touch food unless Aiden sat silently nearby. There were still flinches, still silences. But something was different now. He wasn't alone. And the man who trained him to trust had come back to remind him that not all stories end with the leash dropping. Spring crept quietly into the valley. The frost melted from the grass one morning in early March, revealing soft earth and the faint green promise of new beginnings. It had been 3 months since the shelter. 3 months of long, quiet walks through wind-whipped fields. 3 months of shared silences, gentle training, and small victories. Shadow had stopped pacing at night. He no longer flinched when doors slammed. He began eating with calm certainty. And sometimes, in the late hours, he would fall asleep with his head resting on Aiden's boot, like he used to during their early deployments. But most importantly, he started listening again. To birdsong, to the wind through pine, to Aiden's voice calling him not to obey, but just to come sit. And one morning, he did more than that. He ran, not from fear, not in panic, but with purpose, with joy, with legs that remembered. That day, Aiden knew Shadow was ready. Not for a return to the old missions, those were long behind them both, but for a new kind of work, one rooted not in adrenaline, but in compassion. Aiden reached out to a woman named Dr. Felice Navarro, director of a small, struggling canine-assisted therapy program on the edge of the county. She worked with children, those who had seen too much, victims of house fires, crash survivors, refugees, kids who couldn't talk about what they'd lost, but might sit beside a dog that understood silence better than any therapist. She had space. She had patience. And when she met Shadow, when she saw how he moved through the room without sound or demand, simply existing, present and gentle, she said one thing: he doesn't need training, he already knows. So Shadow began a new chapter. Not with sirens, not with rubble, but in a brightly lit room filled with bean bags, warm blankets, and nervous children. At first they were shy, until one sat beside him, then another. He never moved first, but when they reached out, he didn't flinch. He just blinked slowly, the way he used to with Aiden, the way that said, "I'm here, I'm not leaving, you're safe." Weeks passed. Then one afternoon, Aiden came to pick him up and found him curled beside a boy named Caleb, a 7-year-old who hadn't spoken in almost a year. But in that moment, Aiden saw something that stilled him. Caleb's tiny hand was resting on Shadow's chest, and Shadow's head was in his lap. The boy was whispering. No one could hear what he said, but Shadow's tail thumped once, gently, against the floor. And that was enough. That night, Aiden and Shadow walked the field behind the camper under a full moon. No leash, no commands, just two souls moving in sync again. Shadow paused at the edge of the ridge, wind in his fur, nose lifted to the sky, and Aiden stepped beside him. "You did it," he said, his voice soft. "One last mission." Shadow looked up at him, eyes glowing with something deeper than instinct, something ancient. Not a dog looking for orders, not a partner waiting for praise, but a friend. They never saved another life in rubble, but they helped rebuild something quieter, more fragile, no less sacred. Trust. And that was how it ended. Not with sirens, not with goodbye, but with peace and the soft rhythm of footsteps in grass, moving forward together.